Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo and UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Ukraine, Ms. Denise Braun, for their respective briefings on the situation in Ukraine with regard to the protection of civilians and the humanitarian situation. India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its peoples, particularly for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the recent weeks is deeply worrying. We reiterate our grave concern in this regard. International principles and jurisprudence vest responsibility on parties to the conflict to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are not targeted in situations of armed conflict. Civilians in conflict-affected areas need safe, unhindered, and rapid access to basic services, often provided by humanitarian workers. As we have been reiterating in this Council, all humanitarian aid and assistance must be primarily guided by the universal principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures must not be politicized. Mr. President, since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, India has consistently called for immediate cessation of hostilities and an end to the violence. India has called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue, and also expressed its support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. We believe that no solution can be arrived at the cost of innocent lives. Our Prime Minister has spoken to the presidents of Ukraine and Russia on multiple occasions and reiterated India's position. India stands ready to support all such efforts aimed at de-escalation. The impact of Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe. The conflict is exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. It is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility on these critical issues for the Global South. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. In this context, we hope that the grain deal agreed in June will be implemented by all parties earnestly. However, we believe this alone may not be sufficient to address the food security concerns. Mr. President, India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. On our part, we are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the Global South under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. We hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the calls for humanitarian assistance. We support calls urging for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies. India has so far dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine and stands ready to do more. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me reiterate that the global order is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. I thank you.